Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Tacoma Cyclist. Today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to explore the differences between crit racing in real life and crit racing on Zwift. We're not going to talk about strategies or anything, just really the differences at the end of the race, what it feels like, how it's different. We'll talk a little bit more in some other videos about some strategies that you can take from real life crit racing to Zwift and some strategies you can take from Zwift crit racing to real life. But today we're just going to talk about some of those things that actually make it really, really different. Like where are the differences that you're going to feel while you're doing crit racing in Zwift. Now this is actually pretty specific because the crit races in Zwift take place within what's called Crit City. And it's a forward loop or a backwards loop. So the rest of the races in Zwift are more like road races or circuit races, whereas Crit City is more of a crit style race. That being said, I do think it feels a bit more like a circuit race to start with. It doesn't feel quite like a crit. It's supposed to be that way. There's corners. It's a small circuit, but it is, to me, still a circuit. It's about 2K in length, 2 kilometers in length, so about 1.2 miles. That's a pretty long crit course, though. I mean, certainly we've ridden longer. So let's just jump right in. I'm going to start looking at some of the Strava outputs from both some Zwift races and some real life races in comparison. I'll start with some crits, to compare it to the Zwift races, but I'm also going to look at some shorter circuit races to compare it to the Zwift races as well. So let's jump right in. The footage that you're going to see here is actually not the footage of the Zwift race that I'm comparing. It's the same course, but unfortunately the Strava file versus the video file, the video crashed in the middle of me recording the race that I'm showing you the Strava file for. So ignore that, but let's just jump right into some of that analysis. Okay, so let's take a look at the Crit City race. This is a Crit City race I just did earlier today. It's short. It's a very short race. It's only 8 laps. Some of the ones we'll typically do will be 16 laps, so 20 miles. But this is a very, very short race. So you're going to expect on a race like this that it's going to be super quick. Totally to be expected. It was a super quick race. You can see here the average speed was 28.6 miles an hour with a max speed in the sprint of about 37.1. I did pull out a second place win on this one. It was technically third, but one of the guys got DQ'd. It's a guy I happen to know in the area here who was racing in the Bs, who's a former pro and didn't wear a heart rate monitor. Even if he was wearing a heart rate monitor, he still would have gotten DQ'd because, he was well over power. Anyway, that happens in Zwift races. You have sandbaggers. I got a video on that coming too. So let's talk about the average speed here. In general, in a crit. Now, what I've got here across the screen is I've got a number of various crits that kind of line up to what this crit is. Short, 30-minute crits usually. So, for a Cat 3 racer, 30-minute crit is normal. Maybe 45 minutes. Occasionally, you get the hour-long crits. I'm focusing here on the 30-minute crits because when you're doing a 30-minute crit, it's going to be fast. There's really not going to be any downtime. There's not going to be any slow ups. So it is what it is. It's fast. So here we go. 28.6 miles an hour average. Is that realistic? In my reality, no. Now, I mean, if I were really, truly doing a crit where I was averaging this kind of power, 266 watts on a regular basis, then I would absolutely expect that the speed would be relatively high, especially if others were averaging that too. I only weigh 65 kilograms, actually probably about 63 kilograms right now. So that's pretty high wattage overall. If the whole race were really that strong, then maybe it would be that fast, but still 28.6. As soon as you start factoring in corners or any change in elevation, I feel like that goes out the window. The Crit City races do, in fact, have some elevation gain. So there is elevation up and down. Take it for what it's worth. It's not a whole lot. So comparing that to one of my favorite crits in the area, again, a very short crit, very similar distance. Or time, I should say, and distance. 30-minute crit, 12.8 miles, so only a little bit longer. You can see that the average speed is quite a bit slower overall. 2 miles an hour slower is, in my book, a slower crit. 26.3 miles an hour for a crit is nothing to be sneezed at. And you can see this is not what you would call an easy crit. Ballard crit is pretty well known in the area for having some really tough, even though it's just a 4-corner crit, it's a relatively tough technical crit because after turn 3, you come up on some really nasty brick sections that have very broken pavement area, and then they have a manhole right in the middle. If it's wet, it's a nightmare. There's wrecks here all the time, but it is a fast crit. Not much elevation gain, elevation change overall, very similar, but again, similar overall. Another one that's this is my absolute favorite crit in the area. Smack my crit up. So this is a Volunteer Park crit. Lots of elevation change on this one. You can see 15 miles, 1,400 feet of elevation change. It's one of the reasons it's my favorite crit, because it actually has a climb on every single lap, and it's a brutal little climb, but it's fun. It's just so wicked fun. So that's the next crit that I'll compare it to. This crit is the crit in Tacoma, in fact, also from last year. Similar distance again, similar time. Most of these are about 30 minutes versus the USAC or versus the Zwift one. Okay, this is same crit course, exact same course, exact same day. As a matter of fact, this crit, this one says it's crit 2 of 2. I did the opens, and then I did immediately afterwards, I did the masters. And it was one of those where I literally did a lap to cool down, and as I was pulling up after the cool down lap, I just had to line right back up for the second race. This one was a little bit slower overall, but still same general idea, about a 30-minute crit, about the same amount of distance, give or take, again, a few minutes off here. Slightly longer one here, this is a 40-minute crit. Speed was still pretty high. This was the slower of the two. I did this one back-to-back too, so there were 2 races that day. The faster one was a good mile an hour faster, so it was in the mid-27s, but this was still a good representative race, maybe a little bit longer. Now this is getting into the circuit race here. So this was my first race as a Cat 3. As a non-sprinter, I've always found it difficult to win a lot of races. I pretty much have to get away in a race. Let's get rid of that. No, let's get rid of that. I have to get away in a race to actually win, or I have to win on a climb. I'm not a sprinter. I don't get away. I don't sprint. So it's been tough for me to cat up to a 3, even though I can hold my own in a crit. I just don't get up there in the sprints. So I did finally move up to a Cat 3 last year. This was my first full Cat 3 race. You can see this one's longer. This is a full hour, but this is more akin to what you're going to see, I feel, in the Zwift races, because it's longer. The laps are longer. These are about 2-mile laps, just like a little bit longer than the Zwift races. But most importantly, the cornering is going to be more similar on this than it is on a Zwift race, whereas the cornering in a crit is not the same as the cornering in a crit on Zwift, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then this is just a longer, true circuit race, very, very fast. Also Cat 3 race here. It was fast enough, as a matter of fact, that on this particular race, the Boogeyman Will got 8th place overall on Strava on the lap. Now this is a long running race, and we've had a couple World Tour pros that have raced this race, and Will managed to get 8th place overall on Strava, and that still stands even after the P12s raced later that day. His still is sitting in 8th place overall. So this was fast. All right, so I'm bringing up these particular races because they happen to all be fast races, and that's going to be what we're going to compare against with the Zwift race. So taking a look at that, back to this Crit City race that I raced earlier today. The speed overall is what we want to look at first. 28.6 miles an hour, I don't feel is really representative of an average crit. I think a fast crit for a Cat 2, Cat 3 is going to be in the 27 to 28 mile an hour range. That's a fast crit. This is beyond that. This is well beyond that. I think 1 mile an hour difference between a crit is a noticeable, significant difference. If you've raced at an average speed of 25 and then you go to a 26 mile an hour race, you're going to feel that. It's going to hurt. 28.6, it just doesn't, it's just not true. I'm sorry. There's no way. I love Zwift, but this is where it doesn't get quite realistic. I just don't feel like that was nearly 29 mile an hour crit. Fast? Yes. If we did that type of thing out on the road, there's just no way you're hitting 29 miles an hour. So don't get too excited about that. If we look at some other fast crits in the area, this particular crit, the Ballard crit, has a lot of nice wide sweeping turns, doesn't have much elevation change. You can see similar elevation profile overall to the Zwift race. And this is, heavy hitters come out to this race. This is a fast race. This was also a Cat 3 race. It was a 3-4, but it was, yeah, you race with a 3. So this is a fast race. And average speed here, 263. Yeah, that'd be awesome. 26.3 miles an hour. Same thing with this. Now this volunteer park crit, smack my crit up, is again, lots of elevation change. So you're not going to have the same kind of average speed overall, but you are going to have, this is again a very fast crit. There are no sharp corners. So let me show you the course profile here. There's no sharp corners. So you can pedal through every single thing here. There's no spot where you have to stop pedaling. But because of the hill, it's going to drop that average speed. Same thing here, another fast course, but you can see relatively standard crit, 4-corner crit, right? You'd still have to, if you don't pick a good line, sometimes maybe you're not pedaling through corners. This particular turn here, which is turn 2 on this course, actually turn 1 and turn 2 were both relatively dangerous to pedal through if you weren't in a good line, because this, after turn 2, you ran out of road really fast. It was open and then it closed down. After turn 1, it was challenging. You know what? I'm actually going backwards on this, but still, it's absolutely true. So, sorry, turning here onto turn 2. This is almost a year old. So, turning here onto turn 2, again, the road tightens down really, really fast. Turning here onto turn 3, this road was actually a lot more narrow. So when you turn onto this road, there were a couple wrecks right here in turn 3. But again, a relatively fast 26 mile an hour crit, not much elevation gain. So you can see on a faster race, this one was slow. This one was a pretty slow race. I just keep this in here just to compare, but it's a same exact course, really, really slow. And then Derby Days, this is always a fastest race too. It's pan flat. You can see this elevation, 20 feet over the course of 17 miles, pan flat. But again, average speed, and this was a relatively quick race. What made this one maybe a little slower was because of the fact that this race had like 80 people in it. And if you weren't within the top 5 or 7 wheels going through some of the incredibly wide open turns, the pack was just huge, and you would literally have to stop pedaling, or you'd just be right up in somebody else. Because if somebody in front of you is not pedaling, you can't just pedal right into them. So you would have to sometimes take some risky lines. There was also a nice little manhole that was elevated, and there were many times when I got pretty good air. I got some pretty good bunny hops over top of that thing after turn 1. But again, a relatively fast race, no elevation change. Speed was only 26.3. This is that circuit race. So I want to point out that this was a relatively fast race again, and apparently full contact. I do remember that. I remember kind of slamming shoulders with some folks. It happens. But relatively fast race. It was about an hour long, and even still 26.5. Now this is a P123. So these are some relatively heavy hitters in here. Will and I both hung in with this pack for the entire race, and it was still average 26.5. These races can get significantly faster. This one is Pacific Raceways, which I've got some videos on my site posted about these, but the nice thing about them is you can pedal through every single one of these turns, and it's actually pretty easy to do so. So finally, the circuit race, a true circuit race. Again, this was super duper fast for that day. Look at the elevation gain. Doing almost 25 miles an hour overall on this was relatively fast. So main point here, the speeds you're doing in Zwift races, I don't think they're very representative. If you're doing these in real life, doing a race in real life versus this, don't get too excited about your speed being as high as it is. Again, I'll point out that the power, in fact, was higher, and that's my next point, is that the power on average was higher on this. Yes, for 20 minutes, I averaged 266 watts. Cool. Could I do that on the road? Yes, but there's another reason why it is that I'm not going to do that in a regular crit. Again, if I'm doing that in a regular crit, then it's an incredibly fast crit, but I still don't think it's hitting 28.6. So let's get into that real quick. Just very quickly look at the weighted average power. By the way, weighted average power here and actual power, 263 versus 266, that tells you something. That tells you that I really wasn't ever coasting, and I really wasn't ever depending upon hills. But again, in general, I'm about 10% lower on my average power in a real race versus a crit race. In this case, a lot slower, but again, this was the slow race of the day. This one's a little bit lower, but there's instances as to why, and I'll show those in a minute here. This one, this is relatively normal for that race. Averaging about 215 to 225 is relatively normal for those, even on faster nights. The only time it's not, we have a hilly route, which takes you down this section here, and you've got some good 15% grades on that guy. That will cause the race to slow down, but even still, only maybe 0.2 miles an hour. And then finally, again, even on a hour and a half long circuit race, only about 10% lower. So your power output on a Zwift race expected to be higher than your normal races. But there's a very specific reason for that. And let's take a look here at some analysis. Look at the cadence on this race. Look at how pan flat the cadence on this particular race is. You can see exactly how many times I soft pedaled or stopped pedaling. 0. Now, let's take a look at a relatively fast crit, and we'll do some analysis on that. Here is my cadence, and there were certainly plenty of corners that I pedaled through, but there were certainly plenty of corners, like this is a slower pedal, but certainly plenty of corners where I did not pedal. Here's one with a bunch of sweeping turns, a lot more pedaling through corners, but again, a lot of times where you're just coasting. Like there's a lot of downhills in this. So this section right here, for example, is a downhill. So you can carry 38 miles an hour going into the downhill section without pedaling. But then you're definitely on the gas coming out of it. But again, up, down, and then let's look back here, pan flat, right? Same thing here. Lots of up, down. Some pedaling through the corners, some not. I'd love to say I pedal through every single corner, but you don't always have to. And if you're not trying to stay at the front, then you don't always need to. I'll do it as much as I possibly can, but let's be realistic. Here's a better example where I did pedal a lot more through turns, but even still, there's lots of times where I'm coasting. And you can see not all of these are in turns either. So let me see if I can get that better centered. Here I am, not even in a turn, and I'm coasting. Why am I coasting when I'm not in a turn? Well, it's simple. You're not always on the gas while you're in a real crit. Sometimes you're sitting in the pack and not doing that much power. Nice wide roads on this, but you can see still lots of time where I wasn't pedaling. Okay, and this one's a great example of times. This race, I can pedal through every single turn. There's absolutely no reason to never not pedal, if that makes sense. This turn right here can get a little bit tight, but it's not bad. And you can see there's still times where I'm coasting. But look, I'm coasting here on a straight. I'm not pedaling on this straight, but I'm going 35 miles an hour not pedaling, right? You don't necessarily need to pedal all the time. And then, of course, on the final circuit here, let's look at that. There's, again, same thing. I'm not going through turns here. That one is, okay, that's a turn. But right here, I'm not pedaling, and it's not even really like a hill going down. It's negative 1.5, and I'm not pedaling, and I'm still doing a decent speed. So one of the big challenges in Zwift is you just don't stop. You never stop pedaling. You're always on the gas. Staying in the same analysis screen, let's take a look at that heart rate. Really, really consistent. Of course, in this case, it's kind of going up the whole time until I get towards the end, and then it's nuclear, and oh, look at that. 201 beats per minute. I can do more. I can certainly do higher than that. Again, I'm not a sprinter. I did wind up taking the second in the sprint on this course overall for the day. I don't know how. Actually, I do. I only can do well by doing a 30 to 40 second sprint. If you ask me to do a 15 to 20 second sprint, like a traditional 200 meter, I'm not going to do it. 30 to 40 second sprint, I can hold 600, 700 watts, which is 10 watts per kilogram for 30 to 40 seconds. Absolutely no problem. And you start your sprint with a snap, and then I hold my 600 watts to 700 watts and hold that for 30 to 40 seconds. And I'm usually finishing within the top portion of the pack there. So, but at 201 beats per minute, yeah, you kind of want to puke at the end. So anyway, key takeaway here again, look at that heart rate. It's relatively pan flat. I'm not going to go through all of these again, but let's take a look at the heart rate here. Okay, this was a fast crit, so relatively similar, hearts pegged. This one's different, right? I got some up and down on this one. This is not a flat course. So I've got lows in the 150s. By the way, I have a heart of a small rabbit. So, you know, most races, if I'm in 146 range, that means I'm not going that hard, right? If I'm in the upper 180s to 190s, I can still carry on a conversation at that. Same thing here. Look at the heart rate. It varies quite a bit. Not a whole lot, but I mean, it's up, down, up, down, up, down. This one's all over the map. This one was not a particularly hard crit, so there was plenty of time for me to just kind of recover, so on and so forth. This one, relatively consistent throughout. So heart rate, you know, if your heart's pretty stable, it's not going to be that different in Zwift races, but it's still going to be pretty pan flat there. All right, let's talk a little bit about some of the general things that are different in Zwift races than in regular races. In this, I'm not going to really look too much at the analysis screens here. I'm just going to kind of talk through these. Number one, cornering. When you're cornering in a Zwift race, again, there's no point in time where I am not pedaling. Again, ideally, yes, in a regular four-corner crit, you should pedal through your corners, but that doesn't always happen. If you're 20th wheel going into a corner, you may not be pedaling through a corner. If you are on the front, maybe sometimes you don't always need to pedal through a corner either. It just depends on what you're trying to do tactically. But on a Zwift race, you absolutely are pedaling through all the corners. Now, if you look at the map here, there's lots of corners here. And in fact, a lot of times what you'll find is that going into some of these corners, you actually need to put out a little bit more power. See, if you look here real carefully, coming into this roundabout right by the finish, I goose the power almost always up from my average, which is, you know, I'm usually sitting around 250 to 260 average on these crits. On these little turns like this, I will goose it up to mid 300s coming into the turn. That helps you to, let me see if I can find another example. Yep, another case right here, mid 300s. You have to do that because otherwise you'll find that you actually drift back in the pack. You could be like second place going into the corner, do a consistent power through the corner, and then all of a sudden you're in like 15th place. On Zwift, to go through a corner and maintain placement or move up, you actually need to hit the power before you get to that corner, maybe a good 50 meters, carry that, and then as soon as you hit the corner, you can actually ease off just a touch, and you'll find that you just shoot right up to the front of the pack. So cornering is totally different. You don't have to worry about wrecks. You know, there's no dive bombing. There's no somebody taking a bad line through a corner. It kind of feels that way sometimes, but you know, you don't have to worry about wrecking. You do have to worry about getting swarmed. You do have to worry about getting popped off the back really fast. But that's kind of real in regular racing. But here's where the real big difference to me comes into play. And this is really kind of my last point. Gaps on Zwift are pretty freaking impossible to close down. They're not entirely impossible, but you're going to burn a lot of matches closing down even a 1 or 2 second gap. If you get stuck behind that gap in a crit on Crit City, good luck closing it down, unless you just happen to be at that one point in time where there's a ceasefire, like everybody's kind of easing off for a second or going into the hills. You might be able to close that down, but you're going to have to put out a big effort. You're going to want to snap that effort. You don't want to ease on the power. On a regular road race or crit, if I'm 1 or 2 seconds off, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll ease my power up. So maybe I'm sitting there at 260 for the crit, 260 watts for the crit. Maybe I'm going to ease that up to 350, 400 and just start to close that gap. If you do that on Zwift, you will just be gapped right away. So you really, really run the risk if you come around one of those corners or if you stop pedaling at any point in time of getting that small gap to open up, in which case you're probably going to be off the back. So that kind of brings us to my last part about that, which is tail gunning. I love tail gunning in crits. if you're really just wanting to save some energy, you know it's not going to be maybe it's a race you're not going to win. Maybe it's a race you just want to kind of observe or practice some of your tactics in. Doing some tail gunning is not a bad thing. You can sit towards the back of the pack. I like to practice moving forward and moving backwards in the pack, right? So I'll tail gun for half of the crit, or like for a couple laps, and then I'll move up in the pack, and I'll practice moving, finding places to move up. If it's not one of my A races or my B race, then I will absolutely do that. In Zwift, if you tail gun, I can almost guarantee you that you will get popped off. And it's real simple. In this race, as well as almost every other Zwift race, what I tend to find is that within the first 2 to 3 minutes, the pack is split almost in half. And it's almost always exactly in half. So I've noticed that usually by, second or third lap through, this particular race, we only had 36 people in it. Honest to God, after the second lap, the front pack was 18 people. If you're tail gunning and you're sitting around 30th out of 36th, and that gap opens up, you're done. You're just absolutely done. In a regular crit, you can close that down. You can move up, you can attack, you can maybe drag 1 or 2 people with you and close it down. But that being said, it's very rarely in any regular crit that within the first 2 laps, half the pack is gone. I've never seen that. I mean, if you guys have seen that, maybe share some of that in the comments, but I sure as heck haven't ever seen that. So be aware, in these types of crits, placement is everything. You need to be towards the front. My general rule of thumb, for the first half of the race, be in the first half of the people. So if you're racing with 50 folks in your race, for the first half of the race, do not go below 25. You will find almost every single time, and I can almost guarantee it, if you're below 25, you're going to have to close a gap, and it's not going to be fun. If you close it, then what you're going to find is you burned a lot of matches getting there. So just be aware. Don't try to do that. Stay towards that top half. So that's my rule of thumb. First half of the race, be in the top half. Last half of the race, be in the top third. So if it says there's 50 people, you need to be in like the top 15 to 17 people, because that's where the gaps are going to really start opening up again after that first half, because people are starting to get really, really tired. Now, a 20-minute race, really probably the first split might be your only split, and that's the case this time. We had 36 people in the race. I think 18 were there after the first half, and I think 18 kind of finished together, strung out a little bit, but it was the top half. So use that however you see fit. But again, first half of the race, stay in the top half. Second half of the race, stay in the top third. Okay, so that's it for now. That was kind of a long breakdown of the differences between real crit racing and Zwift crit racing. We'll get into road races, but I really feel like Zwift road races are great circuit races. So we'll get into that later. But right now, crit versus crit, those are the big differences. Coming up in a couple future videos, I'm going to share what strategies you can take from regular crit racing to Zwift crit racing, and what strategies you can take from Zwift crit racing and apply to regular crit racing. Okay, so that's all I got for today. Thanks so much for checking in, and we'd love it if you throw us a like, or maybe if you have some comments about this video, some observations you've made about what's different, what's the same. Let us know what you'd like to see, and we'll try to respond to that as well. In the meantime, check out some of the other videos on our channel, and we'll hope to see you back soon. Thanks.